There is a sound that stays with you long after the room has gone quiet. And for Claire Bennett, it was the sound of a folded check sliding across a white tablecloth. She was 3 months pregnant, sitting at her mother-in-law's dining table on an ordinary Tuesday evening, surrounded by people who were supposed to love her, when the woman across from her tapped that check once with a manicured nail and said the words that would end up costing her almost everything she had spent 30 years protecting. Claire did not know it yet, but she was not being mocked because her mother-in-law doubted a pregnancy. She was being mocked because her mother-in-law was terrified of what that pregnancy was legally about to unlock, and no amount of humiliation was going to stop it in time. Margaret Bennett had never raised her voice in anger in the 14 years Claire had known her, and that was exactly what made this moment so unbearable to watch. She did not shout. She smiled the way she always smiled at charity dinners and hospital gala committees, calm and composed, and she said, $10,000, the day you bring me a real ultrasound with a real doctor's name on it. Not one of those printouts anyone could make at a copy shop, and I will hand you this check myself. Claire's husband Ryan went pale beside her. Somewhere down the table, a fork clattered against a plate, and Claire, who had spent years absorbing every quiet insult this woman had ever aimed at her, did something nobody at that table expected. She looked her mother-in-law directly in the eye and said 6 words that would define the next 2 months of her life. Then come to the appointment yourself. Claire would later say that the strangest part of that entire evening was not the check itself, or even the words that came with it. It was the silence that followed, the way 12 people who had known each other for years suddenly could not look one another in the eye, the way a celebration meant to welcome a new life into the family had, in the space of a single sentence, turned into something closer to an accusation in a courtroom. She remembers noticing, almost distantly, that her hands were perfectly steady even as her heart pounded, and that somewhere underneath the humiliation, a quieter and colder part of her mind had already begun asking a question nobody else at that table seemed willing to ask out loud. Why would a woman spend 6 years avoiding any mention of grandchildren, only to react this way the moment one was finally on the way? Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the time this story ends, you will understand 3 things that right now do not make any sense at all. Why a woman who had every reason to celebrate a first grandchild instead tried to prove that grandchild did not exist. What was sitting locked inside a filing cabinet in Margaret Bennett's study, one she had never once let her own son open in 14 years of marriage. And what happens to a woman who has spent her entire adult life controlling a family fortune the moment the one thing she cannot control walks into the world anyway, heartbeat and all? This is a story about a bet nobody should have made, and paperwork that told the truth long before anyone at that dinner table did. This is also a story about what it costs a family when one person decides that control is the same thing as love, and about a daughter-in-law who had every reason to walk away from that dinner table forever, yet chose instead to stay long enough to understand exactly why the woman across from her had become someone capable of saying what she said. Somewhere between a folded check and a hospital room a year later, this family would be forced to answer a question that has nothing to do with money at all. What do you do when the person meant to welcome your child into the world is the same person most afraid of what that child's arrival will finally take away from her? Claire Whitfield was 29 years old when she met Ryan Bennett at a community fundraiser in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of event where nobody expects to fall in love, but somehow people always do. She worked as a physical therapist, patient by nature and by profession, the sort of person who noticed pain in other people before they mentioned it themselves. Ryan was quieter, a little guarded, the kind of man who apologized before he had even done anything wrong, and Claire found that endearing long before she understood where it came from. What she did not know yet, what nobody ever tells you when you fall for someone, is that you do not simply marry a person. You marry their entire history. And Ryan's history had a name that would come to define the next decade of Claire's life. That name was Margaret. Margaret Bennett was 61 years old, widowed for nearly a decade, and the sole trustee of a family fortune her late husband Harold had built over 35 years running a chain of regional hardware stores before selling the business for just under $11 million. To the outside world, Margaret was gracious and generous, the kind of woman who chaired the hospital gala committee and always sent handwritten thank you notes within 2 days. But inside her own home, she ran the family exactly the way she had run every board meeting of her life, with total and unquestioned authority over every decision, every dollar, and every relationship that touched the Bennett name. Claire would come to understand, far too slowly, that Margaret's warmth in public and her control in private were two sides of the exact same coin. Claire's own upbringing could not have looked more different. Her parents, a schoolteacher and a mechanic from a small town outside Raleigh, had raised her and her two brothers on careful budgets and shared decisions. Every family purchase discussed openly around the same kitchen table, where homework got done and birthdays got celebrated. Nobody in Claire's family had ever held a fortune large enough to fight over, and she often said later that this was precisely why it took her so long to recognize what she was actually looking at in the Bennett family, because she had simply never encountered a household where love and money had become so completely, quietly tangled together that nobody could easily tell where one ended and the other began. The first time Claire met Margaret, she remembers being asked 4 separate questions within the first 10 minutes of conversation. Where did her family come from? What did her father do for a living? Did she intend to keep working after marriage? And, most strangely of all, had she and Ryan already discussed family planning? Claire brushed it off at the time as old-fashioned curiosity, the kind of nosiness she assumed came standard with a certain generation of mothers. She had no idea it was something closer to due diligence, a woman quietly gathering information about a threat she had not yet decided how to handle. Claire and Ryan married 2 years later in a small ceremony Margaret described as tasteful, a word Claire would eventually learn Margaret used specifically whenever she meant less expensive than she would have preferred. Even Margaret's toast at that wedding was revealing, though nobody recognized it at the time. She spoke for nearly 6 full minutes about Harold, about his work ethic, about the responsibility of carrying a family legacy forward into the next generation, and for perhaps 30 seconds about the two newlyweds actually standing in front of her. A week later, she arrived unannounced at Claire and Ryan's new home carrying a housewarming gift, a framed photograph of Harold's very first hardware store rather than anything resembling a photo of the young couple themselves. Claire remembers laughing about it privately with a friend at the time, calling it eccentric, never once suspecting that it was actually a small, early glimpse into exactly where Margaret believed the center of this family truly belonged, and it was never going to be the marriage itself. There was another moment from those early days that Claire only came to understand much later. During the engagement, Margaret had insisted on personally reviewing the prenuptial agreement Ryan's own attorney had drafted, marking up entire sections in red ink and requesting changes that, at the time, seemed simply overprotective. One clause she pushed hardest to remove entirely concerned the automatic inclusion of any future grandchildren as named beneficiaries on a handful of smaller family accounts, arguing that such details were premature and unnecessary for a couple who was not even married yet. Ryan's attorney eventually agreed to soften the language rather than remove it outright, a small compromise nobody thought twice about at the time, though Claire would later recognize it as the very first quiet skirmish in a war Margaret had apparently been fighting long before anyone else even knew it existed. For the first several years of the marriage, tension simmered but never boiled over completely. Margaret criticized Claire's cooking, her career choices, her opinions at holiday dinners, always delivered with a smile that made the criticism somehow harder to name out loud. Ryan absorbed the friction quietly, the way he always had, caught permanently between the two most important women in his life. Late one night, lying awake beside Claire, he admitted that his mother had not always been this way, that she used to laugh more before Harold passed away, as though grief alone could explain everything that had changed in her. Claire, gently, told him that people rarely become more controlling when their lives are going well, that something else usually has to shift first, and she had no idea yet how completely correct that observation actually was. What Claire slowly began to notice over those early years was a pattern she initially mistook entirely for generosity. Margaret paid for things, a cousin's car repair, a nephew's semester of community college, a new roof for Diane's garage, but every single dollar moved directly through her, personally approved, personally delivered by her own hand, never automated through a bank transfer, never delegated to anyone else in the family to manage on her behalf. It would take years before Claire finally understood that this was never generosity at all. It was a woman making absolutely certain that every financial thread running through this family passed through her own two hands first, and nowhere else. A quiet insistence on control disguised so completely as kindness that almost nobody around her ever thought to question it. But there was one subject Margaret never criticized directly. She simply avoided it entirely, changing the topic so smoothly that most people never noticed the pattern. That subject was grandchildren. Every other mother-in-law in America would have been circling that topic constantly, but Margaret steered around it for 6 full years, and for 6 years, nobody in that family thought to ask themselves why a woman with an opinion about everything had nothing at all to say about her own future grandchildren. Claire was 36 years old when she finally got pregnant, after nearly a year of quietly trying and quietly hoping. The positive test came on a gray Sunday morning in September, and she cried on the bathroom floor for almost 20 minutes before she could even call Ryan in from the yard to tell him. Ryan was overjoyed, the kind of joy that made him want to call his mother immediately, and Claire, without entirely understanding why, found herself wanting to wait just a little longer before that phone call happened. When Ryan finally did call Margaret with the news, there was a pause on the line that Claire counted from where she sat beside him, 6 full seconds of silence before Margaret finally spoke. And even then her only question was whether they had seen a doctor yet. Not a single word of congratulations anywhere in her voice. 3 weeks later, at a family dinner meant to formally announce the pregnancy to the extended Bennett family, Margaret did something that nobody at that table expected, including, it seemed, herself. She rose to her feet, glass in hand, and the room quieted the way rooms do when someone important is about to speak. Instead of a toast, she reached into her handbag and produced a folded check, sliding it across the table toward Claire with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed the moment. $10,000, she said. The day Claire could produce a real ultrasound with a real doctor's name attached, proof that could not be faked at any copy shop in town. For a moment, nobody at that table breathed. Claire's first instinct, one she would describe to friends for months afterward, was almost to laugh, certain this had to be some strange joke a grandmother-to-be would never actually mean. But Margaret was not laughing, and that absence of humor was the first real sign that something about this moment went far deeper than simple bad manners at a family dinner. Margaret's sister Diane was the one who broke the silence first, her voice sharp with disbelief as she asked Margaret if she had lost her mind entirely, reminding her that Claire had been part of this family for 6 years and did not deserve to be accused of lying at her own celebration. Margaret's response was calm, almost rehearsed, insisting that 6 years was exactly long enough for someone to plan something like this, and that if there was truly nothing to hide, $10,000 should be the easiest money anyone in that room had ever earned. Ryan rose halfway out of his chair, asking his mother what was wrong with her, but Margaret only repeated that she wanted proof before the family reorganized itself around a new arrival. Around the table, reactions rippled outward in every direction. A cousin set down his fork mid-bite, staring openly. An aunt exchanged a wide-eyed glance with the woman beside her. A teenage nephew, sensing something worth remembering, quietly began recording on his phone beneath the tablecloth, certain even then that this particular family dinner was not going to be forgotten anytime soon. Nobody at that table fully understood in the moment what they were witnessing. A woman not losing her composure at all, but rather executing something she had clearly rehearsed in private, likely for weeks, waiting only for the right audience to make certain nobody in this family would ever be confused later about what had actually been said and agreed to that night. Claire did not cry, and she did not raise her voice. She stood slowly, looked her mother-in-law directly in the eye, and said the 6 words that would come to define everything that followed. Then come to the appointment yourself. Margaret had clearly expected tears, or anger, or her son rushing to smooth things over the way he always did, but she had not expected an invitation, and for just a moment her composure flickered before she recovered enough to agree, saying only that she would come, and that they would see. Nobody at that table understood yet how much weight was hiding inside that single phrase, "We'll see." But Claire would remember it word for word months later, once she finally understood exactly what her mother-in-law had actually been protecting all along. In the days that followed, The extended family split cleanly down the middle, the way families often do once someone finally says out loud what everyone had quietly wondered about for years. Diane called Claire privately, her voice hushed, saying she had known Margaret for 40 years and had never once seen her behave that way, insisting that whatever this was, it was not really about Claire at all. Those words stayed with Claire longer than almost anything else said that week. If this was not about her, then who or what was it actually about? Claire was not naturally the suspicious type. She was, by every account, patient almost to a fault. But something about the specificity of Margaret's reaction, the coldness underneath the calm, refused to sit quietly in her mind, and she found herself, almost against her own instincts, beginning to ask quiet questions. Not everyone in the family reacted the same way Diane had. A cousin named Todd, who had always been closer to Margaret than the others, quietly suggested to Ryan that perhaps his mother had simply been joking in poor taste, and that stirring up drama over a single awkward comment risked embarrassing the whole family unnecessarily. Ryan's aunt on his father's side, a woman named Sandra, went further, telling Claire directly at a grocery store 2 days later that families like theirs had learned over generations to keep certain conversations private, and that airing grievances so publicly, even grievances that were not her own to air, reflected poorly on everyone involved. Claire listened politely to both of them, said very little in response, and walked away from each conversation more convinced than ever that something about this family's long silence deserved to finally be broken. What struck Claire most about those conversations, thinking back on them later, was how instinctively both Todd and Sandra had reached for the language of privacy and family loyalty without ever once asking whether the accusation itself had actually been true or fair. It was, she would come to realize, the exact same reflex that had allowed Margaret's control to go unquestioned for so many years in the first place. A family culture built around protecting appearances rather than protecting the people who actually made up that family. Claire never raised her voice to either Todd or Sandra, choosing instead to simply keep gathering the pieces of the story quietly, certain that the truth, once it finally surfaced, would not need her to defend it loudly at all. It was during this same week that Claire noticed something small but telling, that Margaret had stopped attending her regular Tuesday morning coffee with 3 other women from the country club, a standing appointment she had kept without fail for as long as Claire had known her. When Claire mentioned this offhandedly to Diane, Diane admitted she had noticed the same thing, and that Margaret had also canceled a scheduled meeting with her financial advisor that same week, an appointment Diane only knew about because she had recommended that advisor to Margaret herself years earlier. Whatever conversation Margaret was avoiding, it seemed to extend well beyond the dinner table and into every corner of her carefully managed life. At work, Claire's distraction became noticeable enough that her supervisor, a woman named Karen who had known her for 6 years, finally asked directly what was wrong. Claire, who rarely discussed her in-laws with anyone, found herself telling the entire story, the check, the toast, the strange phrase about reorganizing the family. Karen listened carefully before saying that in 20 years of working alongside patients and their families, she had seen exactly one kind of person react that way to good news, someone hiding something far larger than simple bad manners. It was a small comment, almost offhand, but it planted something in Claire that would grow steadily over the following weeks, the growing suspicion that Margaret's cruelty was not really aimed at her at all. It was a symptom of something else entirely, something Margaret had been carrying quietly for years. Karen, as it turned out, had a cousin who worked as a paralegal at a small estate planning firm 2 counties over, and over lunch one afternoon she offered, almost casually, to ask her cousin a few general questions about how family trusts typically worked without ever mentioning any names. What came back a few days later was not a specific answer, but a useful piece of general knowledge that stuck with Claire for weeks afterward. Estate attorneys, Karen explained, sometimes build clauses into a trust specifically to prevent one family member from holding on to authority indefinitely, particularly in situations where a surviving spouse might otherwise never willingly hand power over to the next generation. It was not proof of anything specific yet, but it was the first thread Claire had found that actually connected Margaret's strange behavior to something concrete and legal rather than simply emotional. Karen's cousin also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that these kinds of clauses tended to appear far more often than people assumed in families where a surviving spouse had continued running a business or managing significant assets alone after the other spouse's death. She explained that the person who originally built the wealth sometimes worried, quietly and privately, about what would happen to that wealth if their surviving partner were ever left holding it without any real check on their judgment for years at a time. Claire found herself thinking about that comment for days afterward, turning it over the same way she turned over every other fragment of this mystery, slowly beginning to suspect that Harold Bennett had known his own wife's tendencies far better than anyone in the family had ever given him credit for. Claire began searching through old family photo albums and paperwork stored in the garage, most of it belonging to Harold, Margaret's late husband, who had passed away nearly 7 years earlier. It was Harold's older sister, a woman named Ruth, 82 years old and famously unbothered by family politics, who first mentioned almost in passing that the family trust had been rewritten roughly 7 years earlier. Ruth remembered lawyers visiting the house twice that spring, remembered thinking at the time how strange it was that Harold's careful, outright plan for his grandchildren had suddenly needed revising so soon after his death. 7 years. Almost exactly the length of time Margaret had gone silent on the subject of grandchildren. Claire did not yet know what the rewritten trust actually said, but she now had a date, and dates, she was quickly learning, mattered enormously inside this family. Ruth, once she realized Claire was genuinely listening and not simply making polite conversation, kept talking long after Claire had expected the conversation to end. She remembered Harold as a careful man, the kind who read every page of every contract twice before signing anything. And she remembered him saying once, years before he passed, that he worried Margaret would never be able to let go of control over anything once she had it, family included. At the time, Ruth had assumed he meant something small, perhaps which chair someone sat in at holidays, or how the good china was arranged in the cabinet. Looking back, sitting across from Claire at her kitchen table with old photographs spread between them, Ruth admitted she now wondered if Harold had been talking about something considerably larger than furniture all along. All of this unfolded while Claire's own body was quietly changing week by week, a detail that made the entire ordeal feel even more surreal in hindsight. She remembers feeling her first real flutter of movement during the exact week she discovered the probate filing, a small, private moment of joy that arrived tangled up with anger and suspicion in a way she never expected motherhood to feel. She would sit at night with one hand resting on her stomach and the other flipping through old family paperwork, trying to hold two entirely different emotions at once: the quiet wonder of a baby growing inside her, and the cold, creeping realization that someone she had trusted for 14 years might have built an entire architecture of cruelty around that same small, growing life. Ryan, for his part, was beginning to unravel his own long-held assumptions. He had always believed the family trust would eventually pass to him and to any children he might have, exactly as his father had promised him as a boy, and it had simply never occurred to him to ask for the actual legal language behind that promise. When he finally approached his mother directly, gently, asking only to see the trust documents, Margaret's response was sharp in a way Claire had rarely heard before, insisting he would see them when it was time and not a single moment sooner, calling his simple request exactly the kind of interference she had always worried about. Interference from her own son, asking to understand the terms of his own inheritance. It was a strange word to use, and Claire noticed it immediately, filing it away alongside everything else that no longer quite added up. That same week, Ryan drove out alone to visit his father's grave for the first time in nearly a year, something Claire only learned about afterward when she noticed fresh dirt on his shoes. He told her later that he had stood there for almost an hour, trying to reconcile the gentle, soft-spoken father he remembered from childhood with the man who had apparently gone to such extraordinary legal lengths to prepare for a future he would never live to see unfold. He said he did not feel angry at his father, only a strange, aching sadness that Harold had clearly understood something about Margaret that Ryan himself had spent his entire life refusing to see clearly, and that his father had chosen to protect his future grandchildren quietly, through paperwork, rather than ever confronting his wife about it directly while he was still alive to do so. Around this same time, Claire tracked down a man named Walter Hensley, 79 years old, who had worked alongside Harold for nearly 20 years managing the second and third hardware store locations before retiring. She found his name in an old company newsletter tucked inside one of Harold's boxes, and when she called, he agreed to meet her at a diner not far from where the original store once stood. Walter remembered Harold fondly, describing him as a fair boss who trusted his employees with real responsibility, but he grew quieter when Claire brought up Margaret, choosing his words carefully in the way people do when they are deciding how much loyalty they still owe someone from another lifetime. Walter eventually admitted that in the final years before Harold's death, he had noticed a change in how decisions got made at the company, more of them quietly requiring Margaret sign off, even matters that had nothing directly to do with her. He remembered Harold joking once, in a tone that did not entirely sound like a joke, that he sometimes wondered what would happen to the business, and to the family, if he was no longer around to balance things out. Walter had assumed at the time this was simply the ordinary worry of an aging man thinking about his legacy. Sitting across from Claire all these years later, hearing about a rewritten trust and a clause tied to grandchildren, he admitted it sounded less like an ordinary worry and more like Harold had quietly been preparing for exactly this outcome long before anyone else in the family had noticed anything was wrong at all. For a brief and unsettling week, Claire believed she had stumbled onto something else entirely, an old photograph tucked inside one of Harold's business ledgers showing an unfamiliar young woman from decades earlier. Family friends began quietly whispering theories: an affair, a hidden child, perhaps an entire second family Margaret had spent 30 years concealing from everyone around her. It turned out to be nothing more than an old employee photograph from Harold's very first hardware store, a bookkeeper named Carol, and who had no connection to the family whatsoever. It was a dead end, but it cost Claire an entire week of sleepless nights wondering whether the truth might be even darker than anything she had imagined so far, and it taught her, painfully, how easily a family's silence could be filled with the wrong story entirely. Still needing to understand what a clause about family reorganization could actually mean in practical terms, Claire reached out to an old college friend named Melissa, now a certified financial planner working 2 towns over. Over coffee, Melissa explained that without seeing the actual document, she could only speak in generalities, but that it was not unusual for wealthy families to build trigger clauses into a trust, conditions that automatically shifted control the moment certain life events occurred: a death, a marriage, and sometimes, less commonly, a birth. When Claire asked why anyone would build a trigger around something as simple as a birth, Melissa explained that it usually existed to protect the next generation from a trustee who might otherwise hold on to power indefinitely, and that this arrangement typically only appeared when the person who originally set up the trust did not fully trust the very person he was leaving in charge of it. Claire sat with that sentence for a long time after Melissa left for her next appointment. Doesn't fully trust the person he's leaving in charge. Was it possible that Harold Bennett, sweet and soft-spoken by every account Claire had ever heard, had quietly built a trap door beneath his own wife's feet years before she would ever need to fall through it? Claire also tried the county records office on her lunch break, requesting whatever public probate filings existed for Harold's estate, and buried among dry legal paperwork, she found a single line noting that a petition to modify an irrevocable trust had been filed 7 years earlier and had ultimately been granted. An irrevocable trust is, by definition, supposed to be extraordinarily difficult to alter after someone's death, and the fact that one had been successfully modified at all told Claire that whatever Margaret had changed, she had fought hard and paid significant legal fees to make that change happen. That evening, Claire and Ryan sat together at their kitchen table with a laptop between them, reading through general explanations of trust law until well past midnight. The way 2 people do when they finally sense they are close to understanding something that has quietly shaped their entire marriage. They learned that irrevocable trusts typically require either the consent of every named beneficiary or a court order to modify, and that courts usually only grant such petitions when the change can be shown to serve the original intent of the person who created the trust in the first place. Ryan grew quiet reading that particular detail, turning to Claire and asking how a court could possibly have decided that cutting him out of decisions about his own inheritance served his father's intent, when his father had spent his whole life telling him the opposite was true. Neither of them slept well that night. Claire remembers lying awake beside Ryan, listening to him turn restlessly beside her, both of them running through the same handful of unanswered questions again and again without ever landing on an answer that made sense. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Ryan finally said out loud what Claire had been quietly circling for weeks without daring to say it herself, that maybe his mother had not just changed the trust to protect the business. Maybe she had changed it to protect herself from something or someone, and neither of them yet understood who that someone might eventually turn out to be. With so many fragments now gathered, but no single sentence connecting them, everything eventually led back to one date circled in red ink on Claire's calendar, the 20-week anatomy scan, the very appointment Margaret herself had insisted on attending in person. Claire sat in the waiting room that morning more nervous than she had been at any point in the entire pregnancy, not because of the baby, but because of what her mother-in-law's presence in that room might finally reveal. She remembers watching the second hand move around the clock on the wall, rehearsing in her mind everything she now suspected, wondering whether she would say any of it out loud today or simply wait, the way she had learned to wait with this family for 14 years, until the truth revealed itself entirely on its own. Margaret arrived exactly on time and did not remove her coat, standing near the door for the entire appointment as though she intended to leave the moment her point had been proven. Ryan sat close beside Claire, his knee bouncing slightly, the way it always did when he was anxious, and for the first time in weeks Claire reached over and placed a steadying hand on his leg, unsure at that point whether she was calming him or herself. Dr. Susan Reyes, who had cared for Claire for 4 years and knew nothing whatsoever about the family tension surrounding this particular visit, was startled when Margaret spoke first, before even a simple greeting had been exchanged, demanding the full scan in writing, complete with gestational age, printed clearly on official letterhead. The scan began, and the room fell almost completely silent except for the low hum of the machine, until a fast and unmistakable heartbeat filled the space around them. For nearly a full minute, nobody in that room spoke at all. Claire's eyes filled with tears as she watched the screen, Ryan gripping her hand tightly beside her, and even Margaret, still standing near the door with her arms crossed, fell entirely quiet. Dr. Reyes printed the images, wrote the gestational age and estimated due date clearly on her own letterhead, and slid the paper toward Margaret, saying simply that everything looked completely healthy and that this was the documentation she had asked for. Margaret's hand was not entirely steady as she took the page, reading it twice before folding it carefully and placing it into her handbag without a single word of celebration. Claire remembers watching her mother-in-law's face in that moment with an unusual clarity, the way you sometimes remember the smallest details of the most important minutes of your life. She noticed the slight tremor in Margaret's fingers, the way her eyes moved rapidly across the page as though searching for some error that might still save her, the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly the instant Dr. Reyes said the word healthy out loud. It was, Claire would say later, the first time in 14 years she had ever seen her mother-in-law look genuinely frightened rather than simply displeased, and something about that fear, more than the folded check or the toast weeks earlier, was what finally convinced Claire she was standing at the edge of something far larger than a simple family disagreement. This was the exact moment the entire family had expected Margaret to finally soften, to apologize, or at the very least to say something warm about the grandchild she had spent 6 years refusing to even discuss. Instead, what she said stopped the room completely cold. She said only that she would need to call the family attorney that same evening. Ryan turned to her immediately, asking what any of this had to do with an attorney, and Margaret's only response was that he would not understand, not until he had actually read what she and his father had agreed to years earlier. Claire, watching her mother-in-law fold that ultrasound paper with trembling hands, finally understood. 2 months of scattered fragments, the rewritten trust, the strange phrase about reorganizing, Ruth's memory of lawyers visiting twice in one spring, all of it assembled itself into a single, devastating picture in the space of one sentence. That evening, Margaret sat alone in Harold's old study, the same room housing the locked filing cabinet nobody in the family had ever been permitted to open, and made a phone call that lasted nearly 40 minutes. Diane, who happened to stop by unannounced with a casserole dish she had promised to return, later told Claire that she had heard fragments of that conversation through the closed door, Margaret's voice tight and clipped in a way Diane had rarely heard before, asking repeatedly whether there was any way at all to delay what she kept calling the transfer date. Diane said she left the casserole dish on the porch that night rather than knock, sensing correctly that whatever was happening behind that door was not something she was meant to witness. It took only one phone call and 48 hours for the full truth to surface. Ryan, as a named beneficiary of the original trust, had every legal right to formally request a copy of the current document, a right Margaret had spent 7 years quietly hoping he would never think to exercise. A courier envelope arrived 2 days later, and Ryan's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the dense legal pages at their kitchen table. Buried on page 14, added quietly just months after Harold's death, was a single clause Margaret had never once disclosed to her own son. It stated plainly that in the event of the birth of a living grandchild to any named beneficiary, trustee authority and sole discretionary control over the entire family trust would automatically transfer to an independent fiduciary board within 90 days of that birth. A living grandchild, not the death of Ryan, not the death of Margaret, simply the birth of a grandchild, any grandchild at all, would strip Margaret of the very control she had held completely unquestioned for 7 full years. Ryan read the clause 3 times before finally saying, almost in a whisper, that his mother had never been afraid the baby was not real. She had been afraid it was. Harold Bennett, it turned out, had never fully trusted his wife to manage the family fortune alone forever, and had quietly built a safeguard into his own estate designed to hand real financial power to the next generation the very moment that generation actually arrived in the world. Margaret had spent 7 years avoiding any mention of grandchildren, not because she did not want them, but because every month without a pregnancy in the family was another month of total, uncontested control over $11 million. Still not entirely trusting his own reading of such a dense legal document, Ryan asked Melissa to recommend an independent attorney who had never worked for the family before, someone with no history with Margaret at all, simply to confirm that he was interpreting the clause correctly. That attorney, a calm and unhurried woman named Patricia Odom, read through the document twice in front of them before confirming that Ryan's understanding was exactly right, and that clauses like this one, while unusual, were considered entirely enforceable under state law, particularly when a court had already formally approved the original modification years earlier. She told them plainly that once a doctor's documentation of a living birth existed, the 90-day transfer of authority was not something Margaret could delay, negotiate, or quietly walk back, no matter how many attorneys of her own she called that night. Suddenly, 7 years of strange behavior reassembled itself into a coherent pattern. Margaret's discomfort at cousins' baby showers, where she always found a reason to leave early, citing a headache or an early morning appointment that somehow never actually existed when anyone checked. Her insistence on personally approving every family expense, no matter how small, always paid from her own hands rather than any shared account, even birthday gifts for children who were not yet born. Her refusal to delegate a single financial decision to anyone else in the family, ever, not even routine matters that any ordinary trustee would have happily handed off to an accountant years earlier. None of it had been generosity, as Claire had once assumed. It had been a woman making absolutely certain that every financial thread in this family ran through her own 2 hands and nowhere else. Even Margaret's strange 4-question interrogation on the very first night Claire had met her, the questions about family background, about career plans, about whether children were already being discussed, suddenly read completely differently in hindsight. She had not been screening Claire for suitability as a daughter-in-law at all. She had been quietly assessing how much time she likely had left before someone in this family produced the exact kind of grandchild that would end her authority for good, gathering information the way any careful strategist gathers information about an opponent whose next move remains uncertain. And when the pregnancy she had quietly feared for 7 years finally arrived, Margaret did not panic quietly the way most people might. She did exactly what controlling people so often do when they feel real power slipping through their fingers. She tried to publicly discredit the one thing she could not actually stop from happening. If Margaret could prove the pregnancy was fake, there would be nothing left to trigger the clause at all. If she could humiliate Claire badly enough, perhaps into leaving the family altogether, the 90-day countdown might never even begin. She had bet $10,000 on a lie she had somehow convinced herself was true, and the very paperwork she had demanded from her own daughter-in-law turned out to be the exact paperwork that would end her 7-year reign over the family fortune for good. 3 weeks later, the family gathered again, not for another dinner this time, but for a formal reading of the trust's actual terms, guided by an estate attorney none of them had ever met before, appointed specifically because Harold's original will had required independent oversight in precisely this kind of situation. The conference room itself felt almost deliberately plain, wood paneling, a long table, a pitcher of water nobody touched. Margaret arrived first, seated alone at one end of the table for nearly 10 minutes before anyone else walked in, and Claire remembers thinking, watching her through the glass door, that she had never seen this woman look quite so small in any room before. When Ryan and Claire finally entered, Margaret did not look up immediately, choosing instead to smooth an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve, a gesture Claire recognized instantly as the same nervous habit she performed at every formal event she had ever attended, a small tell that composure, for Margaret, had always required active effort rather than coming naturally. Inside that conference room, the attorney explained that the new fiduciary board would consist of 5 members, Margaret among them, alongside an independent accountant, a family law attorney, and 2 Bennett cousins agreed upon by consensus. The attorney told Margaret plainly that Harold's original documents had been unusually specific about this exact scenario, that he had wanted to guarantee no single person, including her, could ever hold unchecked authority over the trust once a 3rd generation existed, and that he had built this entire mechanism 7 years before any of them were sitting in that room together. For the first time in the entire story, something like real grief crossed Margaret's face, not grief over the money itself, but grief at finally understanding just how well her own late husband had understood her, all along, without ever saying a word about it to her face. Margaret said quietly that Harold had known all along exactly what she would do if she were ever given the chance, and it was, in its own strange way, the saddest moment in the entire story so far. Not a woman caught in a simple lie, but a woman confronted with the fact that her own late husband had built a legal safeguard specifically because he understood her limitations better than she understood them herself. Ryan, who had spent his entire adult life deferring to his mother's judgment without question, found himself, unexpectedly, feeling sorry for her even as the paperwork stripped away the very control she had spent 7 years protecting so fiercely. Claire, sitting beside her husband, felt something unexpected rise in her own chest as well, not triumph, but something closer to quiet pity for a woman who had built her entire identity around managing what her husband had left behind. Later that day, Claire found Margaret sitting alone on a bench in the hallway outside the attorney's office, her coat still on, staring at nothing in particular. Claire sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance, and told her gently that she could have simply admitted she was afraid of losing control, and that the family would have found a way to include her regardless. Instead, Margaret had chosen to make Claire out to be a liar in front of everyone who mattered to her. Margaret was quiet for a long moment before she finally spoke, her voice smaller than Claire had ever heard it. She said that after Harold died, she had woken up one morning and realized that managing his money was the only thing left that made her feel like she still had a purpose in this world, that her friends had their husbands, their gardens, their grandchildren already grown, and all she had was a spreadsheet and a filing cabinet full of numbers that finally, for the first time in her life, answered only to her. She said she had told herself for years that protecting the trust was the same thing as protecting the family, and that somewhere along the way she had genuinely stopped being able to tell the two apart. Margaret, without looking up, admitted quietly that she had built her entire identity around managing what Harold left behind, and that she genuinely did not know who she was without that control, saying it had simply felt easier to doubt Claire than to admit what she was actually afraid of all along. It was not exactly an apology, but for a woman who had never once admitted fault to anyone in 30 years, it was the closest thing to real honesty Claire had ever heard cross her lips. The independent fiduciary board took over full management of the Bennett Trust within the required 90 days, exactly as Harold had designed it to happen from the very beginning. Margaret retained a single seat on that board, one vote among 5, And for the very first time in her adult life, she was no longer able to make a single unilateral decision about anyone else's future but her own. She still attended family dinners in the months that followed. She still had strong opinions about kitchen paint colors and holiday centerpieces. But something inside her had visibly cracked open, the particular hardness of a woman defending a long-held secret softening slowly into something closer to quiet, chastened humility that nobody in the family had ever seen from her before. Driving home from the attorney's office that same afternoon, Ryan asked Claire quietly whether she thought he should forgive his mother, and Claire found herself without an easy answer, turning the question over for several miles before finally saying that forgiveness and trust did not have to arrive together, that Ryan could choose to still love his mother without ever again mistaking her calmness for safety. Ryan nodded slowly at that, staring out the window at the passing houses, and admitted that some part of him had known for years that something underneath his mother's control was not simply personality, but fear, and that he almost wished she had trusted him enough, just once, to say so honestly instead of forcing a doctor's appointment to say it for her. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy baby girl weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, Margaret was the very last family member to enter the hospital room, standing at the foot of the bed for a long moment before Claire, without saying a single word, simply held the baby out toward her. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she took her granddaughter for the first time, and something in her expression finally looked completely undefended, completely without pretense, for what may have been the first time Claire had ever witnessed in 14 years of knowing this woman. Whatever Margaret had spent 7 long years afraid of losing, in that quiet hospital room, she finally seemed to understand exactly what she had almost let herself lose instead, and no amount of money in any trust could have ever measured up to that particular cost. Whether that moment represented true forgiveness or simply the beginning of a much longer road back toward it, only time would eventually tell. But the $10,000 check Margaret had once slid across a dinner table as a weapon sat uncashed for months in the top drawer of the baby's dresser, kept there not as revenge, but as a quiet reminder of exactly how close one family had come to losing everything that actually mattered, all because one woman confused control with love for far too long. Claire would sometimes take that check out and look at it late at night, long after everyone else in the house had gone to sleep, tracing the folded creases with her thumb and thinking about how differently this entire story could have ended. If she had cried at that dinner table instead of standing her ground. If she had simply avoided Margaret rather than inviting her into that ultrasound room. If Harold Bennett had never sat down with his own attorney 7 years earlier and quietly decided that love, real love, sometimes has to be protected by paperwork when a person cannot yet protect it with trust alone. She kept the check exactly where it was, a small paper reminder tucked among tiny socks and folded blankets, that some families need a little help finding their way back to each other, and that sometimes, that help arrives in the last place anyone expects to find it. A year later, at the baby's first birthday party, Claire watched Margaret sitting on the living room floor in a dress far too nice for cake and frosting, patiently helping her granddaughter blow out a single candle. Laughing in a way Claire had genuinely never once heard her laugh before in 14 years. Diane caught Claire's eye from across the room and simply shook her head slowly, smiling, as if to say neither of them could quite believe how far this particular woman had come in 12 short months. Ryan, standing beside Claire with his arm around her shoulders, admitted quietly that he sometimes still felt the old instinct to defer to his mother before making a decision, but that for the first time in his adult life, he no longer felt afraid of what might happen if he simply did not. Later that evening, once most of the guests had gone home and the wrapping paper had been cleared away, Margaret found Claire alone in the kitchen washing dishes and stood beside her for a moment without saying anything at all. She finally said, quietly, that she knew an apology could not undo the year they had all lived through, and that she did not expect Claire to forget the check, or the toast, or the 6 seconds of silence on the phone the day they first shared the news. But she said she was grateful, more than she knew how to properly express, that Claire had chosen to invite her back into this family's life, instead of simply closing the door on her the way anyone would have understood completely. Claire dried her hands, looked at her mother-in-law for a long moment, and said only that everyone deserved one honest chance to become someone better than their worst moment, and that this past year had shown her Margaret was finally willing to take it. Every family has someone like Margaret hiding somewhere inside it. Someone who mistakes control for protection and only ever understands the difference once it feels almost too late to fix. If someone in your own family has ever tried to rewrite the rules the moment real power was about to shift away from them, tell us about it in the comments below, because we read every single one of them. And your story might be exactly what someone else watching tonight needs to hear.